call to order. And I can turn this over to you, Skylar. Shall I read my little thing and then turn it over? Okay. I'll read from that. This is the annual meeting of the New England Coalition on Nuclear Pollution. I am Ned Childs, Edward C. Childs, the outgoing and replaced ex-president of the Board of Trustees, and I will turn the podium over to our new president, duly elected in regular meeting recently of the Board of Trustees, to Skylar Gould, whom we all know and love, and will get to know better over the coming time. To whom it may concern, the past year has witnessed the spooling up of interest in a sale of Vermont Yankee from Entergy Nuclear to North Star Services, LLC. The buyer is a new entity created to decommission Vermont Yankee as a lever to entering the nuclear power plant decommissioning business, alongside its more experienced partners, including Areva Nuclear, an arm of the French nuclear utility Électricité de France. And for more information on EDF, talk to Peter van der Doos. He speaks fluent French. As always, New England Coalition is an interested party to the process. While NEC believes a prompt cleanup of the contaminated site is in everyone's best interests, NEC has raised serious doubts about the methodology which the new buyer seeks to employ for its decommissioning activities, as well as additional serious doubts about the financial integrity and viability of the buyer. Right now, we are engaged with the sale review process at the Vermont Public Service Board, with Ray Shaddis and Arnie Gunderson acting as expert witnesses for the coalition, and Jim Dumont providing expert legal advice. This is a major undertaking, yet we believe it is a vital action, especially in the age of Trump, when executive decisions are taken for greedy and selfish reasons rather than holding the public welfare sacrosanct. The courts and similar review panels must be used to their maximum extent, if only to rein in an excessively cynical and short-term focused executive branch and business community. And you can quote me. Over the past year, our new president of the board, Skylar Gould, has moved to Brattleboro and come to live here with a wonderful woman, Tina. Tina's out here. He has taken a huge interest in the business of the coalition's intervention efforts. He has committed enormous amounts of time and energy to assist the coalition to carry out its vital functions. Recently, Skylar has agreed to assume the duties of president of the Board of Trustees as I myself step back into a simpleton-like member of the board status. Jim Kirby has agreed to return to the board as treasurer for a one-year trial period, and Lori Cartwright has moved temporarily to Florida, but she still expects to serve on the board for the time being by telephone. Jake Stewart and Ray Shaddis and Sylvia Field continue to serve on the board alongside our faithful staffer, Clay Turnbull. A moment on Clay. Despite having to serve the coalition on a regular basis, on a practically volunteer basis, Clay has kept his faith to this organization. Without Clay's tireless efforts, it is surely doubtful we would still function at all. On top of this Sisyphean task of devotion, in the past year, Clay endured a nasty lawsuit for criminal trespass from Entergy, which has thankfully been dropped. Clay and Chiclet have been restored their natural rights as citizen activists. And applause. Okay, enough. The coalition has managed to stay afloat, primarily due to the generosity of its longtime members, as well as to the continued generosity of a few key individuals, Donald Trump not being among them, sadly, somehow. We hope that support from the membership continues, and that new members can also be attracted into the fight. Against, unsustainable, goes right up there with Sisyphean for a lisp-plagued orator. Unsustainable and irresponsible nuclear power schemes and for proper decommissioning activities. I don't know if Ray likes the wording, but he's not here yet, so we'll let it slide. We have maintained a very frugal existence. Almost all our support, as you know, goes directly to pay the expenses of those experts who testify and engage on our behalf. We continue to insist that the generation of long-lived nuclear waste from nuclear power stations is an unwarranted financial burden on present and future terrestrial ecosystems. And yes, I did take a course in terrestrial ecosystems at the Yale School of Forestry. And that includes humans. Please keep us in mind as this year-end fundraising season approaches, or for any special gifts and expressions of financial support in the meantime. Yours sincerely, Edward Calder, Ned Childs, Dummerston, Vermont. Thank you. So having accomplished my natural function in delivering a president's report and going out, I now cede and deliver to you Skylar Gould into your good keeping. Thank you.
I wasn't told when I took this job on that I would have to stand up here and perform. If you look at we did revise the schedule. There have been some significant revisions to the schedule. Winona LeDuc will not be flying in on the wires to address us, but we have chosen some choice words of hers to address our struggle here. We did originally anticipate Richard Holshoe being here. He's the spokesperson for the local Elnu Abenaki tribe. We've been partnering him much in our activities in front of the Public Utilities Commission. He could not make it today, but he did extend his greeting to us all. Uli, as he extended to me as a newcomer to this area, Uli Palu Wantastikat. Welcome to Wantastikat. Thank you, Richard. This is their land, the Abenakis. He teaches us as well, these waters, just a stone's throw from here, Quinidikak, the long river, is not a border, he says. It is a river. It is our river. It is our river too, but we bear reminding that ours are not the only voices needing to be heard in this discussion. I'd like to point out a new friend here, Kira Hishin. She's a student at Antioch, New England, in the class in digital communications, and she's volunteering to help us pull together some of our media presence, and I've suggested that it's all right for her to get a few pictures of us during the meeting and during the afternoon. She also would like, if anybody is up to it, she would like to do in the room in the back here, she'd like to video anyone who has any particular thoughts that they would like to share about the struggle that we're engaged in. And we're looking forward to working with her in the future too. Yes, thank you. Not to go all religious on you or anything, but I'd like us to try a simple reflection. This is from Jack Cornfield. Imagine you could look back over this next year when you were at the end of your life. And imagine, among all the demands of your life, that you had chosen to stand up for one cause, something you truly care about. It might be global or local, climate change, hunger, refugees, children, justice, whatever matters to you. And imagine how you feel at the end of your days, having done so, having placed this make-weight on the scale of the earth. Now imagine the first step, what you envisioned, who you contacted, how you began. Finally, imagine how you can begin in the weeks ahead. So I'm winging now the state of the state, the state of New England Coalition, the so-called President's Report. The only thing worse than one President's Report is two President's Reports. I should note as well, we're looking forward to we're going to conduct our business meeting at 2 approximately. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and then we're going to have presentations. Tina, my partner Tina, and I will be reading some words from Winona LaDuke. Our own Ray Shaddis will be, both Ray Shaddis and Arnie Gunderson are chosen expert witnesses in front of the Public Utility Commission for this docket around the sale of, proposed sale of Vermont Yankee by Energy to North Star Corporation, a limited, not to repeat myself, a limited liability corporation that was formed still less than a year ago. So we're going to get an update from Ray on what exactly we're doing here, why we're doing what we're doing. And then we're going to get an update from Arnie, who's just back from Japan, on Fukushima and new disturbing evidence around the ongoing pollution debacle there. We'll take another break, and then our guest speaker, David Kraft, he's the founder director of Nuclear Energy Information Service in Chicago. I'll give him a little more of an introduction later on. He's a giant in the work that we do. So the state of the state in front of the Public Utility Commission, formerly the Public Services Board. I imagine most of you have certainly picked up on the ongoing. There's been a lot of news about this. A lot of people are very concerned about it. You may remember in the beginning when this was first coming out of North Star's almost paranoid concern about their business plan being even discussed. They weren't even, and theoretically we were told, have not even shared this plan with Entergy. And their concern being that this is a very lucrative industry that they're getting into. They would have us believe that, this is an aside which I'll repeat, Entergy and North Star are trying to have us believe that if this deal doesn't go through, Vermont Yankee will sit there for another 50 years. That nobody else is interested in this thing. Well, in fact, there are Entergy in particular is very anxious to get this liability off of their books, and Entergy is very interested. North Star is very interested in entering the fray of decommissioning. There are billions and billions and billions of dollars at stake, and much of it coming up very quickly. Important note, this is the first reactor, so-called merchant reactor, which is privately owned, not by a utility, not by a consortium of utilities that have a ratepayer base to go back to. Should there be any problems during the decommissioning process? The importance of that is easily noted when they decommissioned Connecticut Yankee. They ran into a $400 million cost overrun. Every plant decommissioning in this country, save one, has gone 30% or more over budget. This is the first merchant plant to be decommissioned in this country. And Entergy, a $12 billion corporation, publicly traded corporation, They want to sell the plant and all its responsibilities with the decommissioning trust fund, now at around $650 million. Less than a year ago, Energy was saying it was going to take twice that to decommission the plant. They want to sell the plant and the responsibility to decommission it to a limited liability corporation, less than a year old, that has no assets. No ratepayer base to fall back on. Contrary to much of the press that comes out around this issue from that side, from their side, their proxies really, you can tell that some of the wording is even the same. New England Coalition, I believe everyone here in the room would agree, is very anxious to get this plant decommissioned as quickly as possible. There's no question about that. But we at New England Coalition, and turns out the state as well, particularly the Agency of Natural Resources and the Department of Public Service, they are very concerned because if North Star goes belly up, the state will be holding the bag. And they're particularly concerned about the radiological cleanliness of the site when the decommissioning is complete, as are we, and they're very concerned about the financial viability of the company that's proposing to decommission it. These are questions which we hammered. We were the first intervener, even before the state, although I guess DPS is a natural intervener. A&R came in. Just another aside, we were heartened by Clay, who is at the Historical Commission, Vermont Historical Commission?
Vermont Historical Preservation Commission.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure. They, at this very late date, have decided that they're interested in becoming an intervener in front of the Utilities Commission. So there's obviously a lot of interest there. They have enormous amount, I should say Energy and North Star have enormous amounts of money sinking into this because it's worth a lot of money to them. The state can rightfully claim that they don't have an unlimited budget, but they are putting the resources in to do the hard work of analyzing and understanding just what it's going to take to decommission this plant. So again, I'm getting back to when this case first came to the fore. North Star did not want to reveal their business plan, and fortunately, the state. So normally, when a case like this, where private information needs to be discussed in front of the commission, there is a vehicle for protecting trade secrets, information that a company doesn't want to share with the world. And this is a normal procedure. North Star was insisting that these two documents that they have outlining their procedural format for decommissioning the plant, that they didn't want anybody to see it. Absolutely nobody could see it. Well, first, Department of Public Service said, we don't want the responsibility. They said, we have to see it. You can't function in this state without our seeing it. And then Agency of Natural Resources said, well, we have to see it because we have to make a judgment as to how viable your plan is. And then they looked at themselves, I could see, and they were saying, we don't want this sole responsibility because that puts all the onus of any decision that's made around approving or disapproving this plan. We don't want to assume all that responsibility. So And we had made the original motion that this was it was not legal. In fact, it was not legal. And in the end, North Star had to take 1, 2, 3 steps back and finally said, okay, I guess you can see it. So there's the financial issue, which I'll just put aside because I don't understand, I can't begin to understand it, but the state is pursuing that. Actually, I believe Arnie has been addressing that. He's his skills and wisdom and knowledge about these, I can't even grasp how broad they are, not to imagine what it's like to have all this inside of yourself. But he is addressing a lot of the financial issues as well. And he may talk about that a little bit. Our other main concern, which we've been pushing very hard, NEC, which we were surprised somewhat the state was not pushing, did not seem to be pushing very hard on the fact that Energy agreed first when they purchased the plant and then when they closed the plant, they agreed that they would not rubbleize, meaning crush into pieces smaller than 10-inch diameter, I think it's the size, over 1 million cubic feet of concrete. There are other issues around how far down the foundations would be removed, but they wanted to crush, basically crush, they wanted to scab off the surface radiation that's contaminated the concrete to a certain level, crush the concrete, mix more contaminated concrete with less contaminated concrete to reach a certain level of 15 millirems, which is lower than the 25 millirem standard demanded by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, but 5 millirems more than all other New England plants that have been decommissioned to date. And we're contesting not just the radiation level, but the very leaving of this million cubic feet of rubbleized concrete, which again, Energy had agreed twice to not bury it, to take away to a more appropriate site. It pains us, it should pain everyone to think of it, it's the devil's choice. The stuff has to go somewhere. The banks of the Connecticut River is not a good idea. Even if it were not contaminated, it would not be a good idea in any way. And I should say, when they say not contaminated, they say they're only going to bury uncontaminated concrete. Well, that means up to that 15 millirem level. Now, and I'm going to change the subject a little bit. Now, North Star, so that the 15 millirems comes under the name of resident farmer level, which means that a farmer living there, that the exposure to a farmer and his family and the cows and that people that would be a sufficiently low level to allow a resident farmer on the premises. Now they seem to be backing off, and they're talking more about the light industrial level. They're still saying, oh, we're going to carry it to a 15 we're going to reduce it to a 15 millirem. Yes, we have to crush the concrete. But now they're backing off and they're saying, well, we want light industry there. The town wants light industry level there. Well, that's 100 millirem. The allowable level for light industry is 100 millirem. How that's playing out, I can't explain because I don't understand it. It seems somewhat unclear as to what they are committing to, and even if they commit to it, can they be held to it? Can they're saying we commit to 15 millirem, but the NRC only requires 100 millirem for a light industrial site. So it's easy enough for us to imagine that they'll commit to that, but then fall back on the 100 millirem. They seem to be getting nervous about their ability to meet any of these standards. Right now, I won't take too much. Right now, the latest round, both of our experts, Arnie and Ray, have been challenged as being not competent or qualified to act as expert witnesses in front of the Public Utilities Commission. Aside from the fact that they already have repeatedly, aside from the fact that, I mean, Ray's resume, you know, the NRC has paid Ray to come and speak at conferences around the world. Arnie as well, obviously, he's been qualified, he said he couldn't remember, 30 or 40 times he's been qualified as a recognized expert. And I'll just tell one story about the failure of the reporting recently about Ray and Arnie being challenged by Energy and North Star as not being competent. And the comment in the story was, Mr. Shaddis is out of the country. Well, Mr. Shaddis was in St. Petersburg, Russia, at the second annual International Conference on Decommissioning, testifying to an international group of people on decommissioning issues, along with, I might say, the former owner of Maine Yankee, the former, I'm not sure what his position would have been, but he was in charge of Maine Yankee, worked closely with Ray to decommission. It's arguably the most successful decommissioning in the country, and Ray was in the thick of it, and he's obviously qualified to testify. So that's where we're at right now. We're just responding to their motion to dismiss. Those papers are due on Monday. And maybe by the end of the afternoon, I'll remember exactly what the next steps are. But all of it is leading toward this back and forth of submission of testimony, challenge to testimony, challenge to the challenge, just questions asked. It's all leading up to the technical hearings in late January. And that's when the rubber hits the road, is that it? That's when all this back and forth becomes submitted as testimony, is sworn to, and then we have at it. Both sides, their experts, where it's a court. And there will be eventually a decision made by the Public Utilities Commission. Two of the three, the first, forgetting his name, he was newly appointed, he recused himself for conflicts. I should mention as well, we have an open application to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in their review of this license and ownership transfer, and we have not heard from them. And the Department of Public Service is also has applied for intervenor status in front of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It's significant. It's significant because it's important, and we want to get in there and make our points. It's also significant because if either of us is accepted as an intervenor, that will drag out, is not an inappropriate word, will drag out the approval process at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission at least 6 months. Traditionally, it could be even a year, but at least 6 months. They may hasten that process, but it would be a big monkey wrench in what seems at times like a runaway train, this Energy North Star proposal. They said, we have to do it now, we have to get started now. If we don't get done now, then our schedule will be off and it will cost more money and whatnot. But we appreciate that they want to save money. It's our money, theoretically, that they're saving. But we also want this process to slow down a little bit. We want a thorough review in front of the NRC. And we want this project to be well understood before it goes forward.
Little question.
Yes,
Scott, the Public Utilities Commission's a three-person panel.
yes,
You say one of those people has recused on this decision?
yes.
So the two remaining could split theoretically, and then it would be a hung jury? What would
I
happen?
would think, I can't tell you, maybe Ray would know. Clay, I would think you'd need a majority to approve.
Well, they don't say yes or no, it's all the conditions that get placed on it.
Right, so for instance, again, we want this to go forward. What we'd like it to see it done is, we want it to go forward with conditions. We'd like to see no rubblization allowed. So significantly, there are a number of other issues around process and the actual decommissioning. But we'd like in particular that there is no rubblization allowed, that all of the concrete will be removed from the site and taken to a more appropriate, that may be northwest New Mexico.
Wow.
They don't love the thought of it coming either. There might be alternatives, I'm not aware of that. And we want energy, which is, touting this wonderful North Star group. We want them to guarantee it, financial. They're a $12 billion corporation. This seems, recently an article just a couple of days ago, they're saying this is a big sticking block that it'll never go. Well, again, NEC has taken a lot of flack from many quarters that we're fouling this process, that we may, it may fall through because of our interventions. If it falls through, it will be for very good reasons. And we would like to keep getting the word out that we aren't doing this just to be naysayers, needless to say. We're doing this to protect the environment, this generation, and many generations hence. And so we'll see what happens. And, there's a lot of bluff and bluster in this game. And, yeah.
So as far as, we had a waste contract with Texas for, I thought that included all the
It can go there.
concrete that
It can go
would
there.
go to Texas.
Yeah, that was the original plan.
To Texas.
In fact, and I'm still not quite sure, in the original proposal by North Star, they were not to the state. They were not entertaining rubblization. So this, they think in their minds that it's a huge money-making, that they stand to make millions of dollars by being able to bury the, but what's a costly process is they have to monitor, gauge, they have to scrape off the radiation off of the surfaces of the concrete, and it can be a very costly affair. Ray says that when they were faced with this in Maine, they ended up not burying the concrete on site. They ended up taking it away, and it ended up being a wash in terms of cost. So, so we would like to see at least those two. In particular, there are other things regarding the end stage, the end state of the site. But we don't want rubblization, and we want financial guarantees. And I think we've been pushing the rubblization hard enough that the ANR, the Agency of Natural Resources, just one other note, we've noted that in order to bury 1 million cubic feet of concrete, you need a landfill permit. We pointed, a landfill permit. We pointed this out to ANR, Agency of Natural Resources, which administers landfill permits, and they said, oh, right, yes, maybe we should look into this. So that's actually that's a huge point of, we do not feel that the state can just summarily put one of its regulations. So if it does need a landfill permit, another thing to slow this thing down, there would have to be a whole environmental permit process that would accompany that.
Including Act 250.
Including Act 250. So that could be a good, a good reason for them to say, if they, well, you can bury 1 million cubic feet, but you can't do it until you get a landfill permit, and that's going to take another year or two. that may be the kind of deal, condition that will compel them to, maybe we should get this stuff out of here. Yeah,
Yeah, Skylar, my name is Paul Blanche.
yes, Paul.
It may be something I should bring up with Ray and make sure Ray and Arnie are aware of this, but when I was dealing with Connecticut Yankee, and I also worked at Maine Yankee during the decommissioning, you mentioned the resident farmer and the 15 millirem per year. Well, back in the early 90s, I thought that what this meant was if you had a dosimeter or a person on site 24 hours a day, that person would receive no more than 15 millirem additional. But if one really looks at the definition of the resident farmer, and again, Ray or Arnie could clear this up, if a person resided there unprotected, they would be receiving 3 times that amount. The resident farmer assumes by NRC regulations that the farmer only works the land 8 hours a day, and then he goes into his residence that is protected from the external radiation. So someone's going to have to look at that and what it really, really means. And now you mentioned, and I wasn't aware of it, about the industrial of 100 millirem. That might be based on an industry worker only working there 8 hours a day.
Right.
Whereas the total radiation over a 24-hour period would be 300 millirem per year. So Ray and Arnie really need to take a careful look as far as what is the radiation dose. It happens to be different from the radiation dose from an operating nuclear power plant. An operating nuclear power plant is limited at the site boundary to 25 millirem per year. That's 24 hours a day. But once you go into decommissioning, for economic sake, they reduce that, but they don't really let you know about it, to an exposure of only 8 hours a day. So people need to know about that, and I'll talk to Ray a little bit later, and I'm not sure I've worked with Ray.
Unfortunately, the NRC owns the field on radiation, but we certainly need to, I'm not sure what kind of prerogatives the state has in this regard.
They have none.
They have not, yeah. Our newly appointed treasurer, Jim, can you do a two-step up here for?
Well, all I'm going to do is put myself in front of you. Clay, hi, my name's Jim Kirby, and I was on the board for a couple of years, and then I decided that I would do other things, and Skylar put the long arm on me one morning, and I said in a weak moment, yes. So I'm going to be back on the board for a year. I'll look at the books. The books seem all right from a cursory, but I haven't had time to go through them. I will do that in the next couple of weeks. And I'll help Ray and, not Ray, but Skylar. I'll help Skylar raise some more money, because what we need money to keep everything together. It's a very lean ship. If it's a lean ship, I don't know if it floats, but.
Not sinking.
Right. But there's obviously a lot of demands for the future, and I think the thing that all of us should understand is this is going to be a landmark for the rest of the decommissioning in New England and across the country, because these merchant plants all are going to be they're going to be running out of money, and somebody else is going to pick up the tab. It's a question of whether the utility owners are going to pick it up or whether the states are going to pick it up. And my own view is probably the states are going to pick it up, because I think that's just the way it's going to go. But that's a long way into the future. So with that, I'll get out of here and say hello.
On that pleasant note.
On that,
Thanks very much for reminding me of that point, which I never fully quite made. This is the first in the nation of decommissioning of a merchant plant. It's also, is it the first boiling water reactor?
Yep.
It's the first boiling water reactor to be decommissioned, and a decommissioning company that has never decommissioned a nuclear power plant, much less a boiling water reactor that nobody else has done before, wants to take this over. It's fraught with danger. But
I think Big Rock Point may have been decommissioned, I'm not 100% sure about it.
But the larger point is that what happens here is very much a, I'm forgetting the word, the first of its kind. There are many plants coming up. It's a precedent. It's precedent setting. It doesn't mean that that's the way every other plant decommissioning will go. But people will certainly look to this, and the industry will certainly need to take note. And those resident communities who need to muster the resources and energy to get their act together and get a good result for themselves, they'll be looking to this, how we perform here. Just a small note on the finances. We've spent something on the order of, I'm going to hazard a guess here, of $40,000 on legal fees, and we need to do that again. So we are, Clay and I are going to go on the road and look to some larger donors. Please imagine, I mean, it's a lot of money, and people's personal resources can be limited, but any ideas as to people that you know that would be particularly interested, that we might approach, we're ready to approach, we'll go anywhere. We'll get down on our hands and knees. It's actually, in the big picture of things, it's not a lot of money. We're
Are you saying that we have a debt of 40,000, or that we have spent 40,000?
we have spent,
We have spent.
and we need to spend that again to get us through the technical hearings, not to mention keeping us going. I hope I've not spoken out of turn by raising those figures. I don't know
So
exactly.
that's legal and the expert witnesses as well?
And expert witnesses, right. And if we had an extra 5 in there, we would take on another expert witness who we think could help us. So it's a moving target, but please keep us in mind, and we'll do the best we can. Nomination of new or returning trustees. Do we have a process for this, Clay?
Sure. No, I would, Ned, you're willing to serve again?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who else is on?
And Lori is for a year.
So you're nominating. Why you
I present
propose so we can
I
second.
propose for nomination a slate of trustees of Jim Kirby, Lori Cartwright, Ned Childs,
Sylvia?
and myself
And yourself? Oh, these are for renewals,
as a slate.
as a slate. I second the motion. Can I do that?
Or I'll second that.
Okay.
Any discussion?
Are there any new individuals?
We're always
who-
open for volunteers.
We're always open for volunteers. We're always open for new board members. So, can we take just a voice vote on the slate of trustees for the coming year? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Passes unanimously. Thank you very much. We now have an awards ceremony, our favorite thing. This certificate awarded to Ned Childs.
Ooh.
In recognition of sustained effort and extraordinary valor in the fight against nuclear power. During his presidency, Ned's outspokenness on the evils of uranium mining and the nuclear industry was persistent and effective. Vermont Yankee was shut down while Ned was at the helm. We are truly grateful. Thank you, Ned, for all we have done.
All right. Thank you very much.
Dear and dear, this certificate awarded to Peter Vanderdoes. In recognition of sustained effort and selfless impudence in the fight against nuclear power, Peter's consistent and vigilant oversight of the nuclear industry proved valuable to the cause. We especially appreciate Peter's 4 years as NEC's center of gravity, always there in the office where he could always be counted on to go above and beyond the call. Vermont Yankee was shut down on his watch. We are truly grateful. Thank you, Peter, for all you've done.
All right, 1, 2, 3.
And now to the video. You got it.
Handsome dude.
So this is from Winona LaDuke's All Our Relations, Native Struggles for Land and Life. And this is I'm going to attempt this, Haudenosaunee teaching. Obviously an Indian tribe, an Indian people. We are part of everything that is beneath us, above us, and around us. Our past is our present is our future, and our future is 7 generations, past and present. The nuclear industry is hoping for one last twilight dance, says Harvey Wasserman. It's dying in the United States, in Western Europe, and Japan. The big producers are banking on the hopes of sales to India, China, Iran, and maybe Turkey, he says. The problem of nuclear waste, according to Wasserman and others, is unsolvable. The only solution, he says, is to let the stuff sit where it is. Then 50 years from now, hopefully, we'll have better technology to deal with it. George Crocker, executive director of the North American Water Office and a key force in the Prairie Island Coalition, echoes Wasserman. We're basically trying to figure out the best way to bequeath nuclear waste to the next generation. The more we produce, the more overwhelmed the next generation will be, he says grimly. For now, the waste debates in this country always seem to end up with the Indians. That is the reality that Virginia Sanchez continues to struggle with. We have been violated, but we don't have to get stuck in that rut of victimization, Virginia says. We've got our grandmothers, our spiritual people, tribal government representatives, all of them working together and having ceremony together. We do have a lot of power. Knowing that we're making progress, it may be in little bits and pieces, but we are definitely making progress. That's how you begin healing.
Okay, envision me as Winona LaDuke. I'm channeling her soul like that. So I'm honored to do that. She says things pretty eloquently.
Not quite so close.
Oh. Despite our meager resources, we are winning many hard-fought victories on the local level. We have faced down huge waste dumps and multinational mining, lumber, and oil companies. And throughout the Native nations, people continue to fight to protect the earth for future generations. Some of the victories described in this book, this is called All, if you want to read it, it's pretty great, All Our Relations. Some of the victories include a moratorium on mining in the sacred hills of northern Cheyenne, the Blackfeet, and the Crow territories. An international campaign that stopped the building of megadams in northern Canada, the resolution of thousands of acres of white earth, which is where she comes from in northern Minnesota, and the rebuilding of a nation in Hawaii. I'm just gonna take a break. Skylar and I were in Hawaii, and we met, sort of by accident, a native Hawaiian, and there's lots of them. And they really are pulling together to protect the earth. And it's very moving. Okay. Grassroots and land-based struggles characterize most of native environmentalism. We are nations of people with distinct land areas, and our leadership and direction emerge from the land up. Our commitment and tenacity spring from our deep connection to the land. This relationship to land and water is continuously reaffirmed through deed and our way of being. It is perhaps best remembered in phrases like, "This is where our ancestors and children's umbilical cords are buried. That is where the great giant lay down to sleep, and these are the 4 sacred hills between which we were instructed to live." So now she goes on to talk about herself. She is an Anishinaabeg. I can't pronounce this very well. I live on an Anishinaabeg reservation called White Earth in northern Minnesota, where I work on land, culture, and environmental issues locally through an organization called the White Earth Land Recovery Project, and nationally through a native foundation called Honor the Earth. We, the Anishinaabeg, are a forest culture. Our creation, stories, culture, and way of life are entirely based on the forest, the source of our medicinal plants and food, forest animals, and baskets. Virtually my entire reservation was clear-cut to the turn of the century. In 1874, my tribe's leader said, "I cried and prayed that our trees would not be taken from us, for they are as much ours as is this reservation." Our trees provided the foundation for major lumber companies, and their destruction continued for 10 decades. There is a direct link in our community between the loss of biodiversity, the loss of animal and plant life, and the loss of material and cultural wealth of our people. But we have resisted and are restoring. Today we are in litigation against logging expansion. Our experience of survival and resistance is shared with many others. But this is not only about Native people. In the final analysis, the survival of Native America is fundamentally about the collective survival of all human beings. The question of who gets to determine the destiny of the land and of the people who live on it, those with the money and those who prey on the land, is a question that is alive throughout society. The question is posed eloquently by the grandmother, Loretta Pascal. This is my reason for standing up, to protect all around us, to protect all Native cultures. Where did you get the right to destroy my forests and rivers? Why does that right supersede ours? I guess that's about it. I think the beauty of what she says here is that this is the land that we must save for everyone's sake. So there's a closing that Skylar's going to read.
Well, a little more in the closing. Rethinking the Constitution. Walt Brissett, an Anishinaabe man from the Red Cliff Reservation in northern Wisconsin, passed to the next world in early 1999. His passing was a huge loss to the Native environmental movement, but his groundbreaking work on re-envisioning the Constitution and Native treaty rights for the benefit of all people and the earth continues. Brissett was part of the Seventh Generation movement, a movement that calls for a radical amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The preamble to the U.S. Constitution declares its intent to be to, quote, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, unquote. In reality, U.S. laws have been transformed by corporate interests to cater to elite interests in society. While the U.S. Constitution makes no mention of corporations, According to anti-corporate analysts Richard Grossman and Frank Adams, quote, "The history of constitutional law is," as former Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter said, "the history of the impact of the modern corporation on the American scene." Over the course of 2 centuries of court decisions, corporate contracts and their rates of return have been redefined as property that should be protected under the Constitution. In this way, the quote-unquote common good has been redefined as, quote, maximum corporate production and profit, unquote. Appointed judges have handed down decision after decision, increasing the privileges of corporations. Corporations have been granted the power of eminent domain and the right to inflict private injury and personal damage when pursuing, quote-unquote, progressive improvements. Most significantly, in 1886, the Supreme Court treated private corporations as, quote, natural persons, protected by the Constitution and, quote, sheltered by the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment. Consequently, American public policy and the legal system have largely come to reflect short-term views, despite the intergenerational perspective foundational to the U.S. Constitution. At the 1995 United Nations Conference on the Status of Women in Beijing, Corinne Kumar from the Asian Women's Human Rights Campaign spoke of the legal challenges in the national and international arena of this area. The violence of the time, she explained, has outstripped the law. We have little understanding of our protection from the combined and cumulative impact of industrialism's complicated chemical soup on our bodies, ecosystems, or future generations. Public policy is lagging far behind our ability to destroy ourselves. The rights of the people to use and enjoy air, water, and sunlight are essential to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These basic human rights have been impaired by those who discharge toxic substances into the air, water, and land. Contaminating the commons must be recognized as a fundamental wrong in our system of laws, just as defacing private property is wrong. On that basis, the 7th generation amendment to the Constitution of the United States declares the right of citizens of the U.S. to enjoy and use air, water, sunlight, and other renewable resources determined by the Congress to be common property shall not be impaired, nor shall such use impair their availability for use by future generations. Thanks, Wynonna. Now, Ray, Ray needs no introduction. If I tried to, it would go on forever. He is back from Russia from that conference, international conference on decommissioning. Again, he was at the core of the decommissioning of Maine Yankee some years ago now, and he has been at the forefront in all those years. The eminently qualified Ray Shedd.
Some years ago, I was asked to address a breakout session in NRC's annual Regulatory Information Conference, and it occurred to me that I needed to explain that when I graduated from college, when I received my Bachelor of Arts degree in Fine Art, my mother accosted the chairman of the art department and said, "So, can he teach with this?" He said, no teaching credits. And he said, "Well, could he go into commercial art?" He said, "No, we didn't do commercial art, no." Anyway, so I explained to a couple hundred nuclear engineers and executives and regulators, this today is what my art degree prepared me for. My mother would be so happy with it. Yes, sir. So this is going to be very extemporaneous. It should not be a surprise to people who've heard me speak before. The topic here in the flyer here is, why are we here? Well, we're here because nuclear power is unique among the industrial polluters in that its primary pollution consists of radioactive contaminants. They are at once carcinogenic, mutagenic, teratogenic. That is, they cause cancers, cancers, genetic defects, and birth defects. And not only in the human species, but throughout the biotic community. The release of radioactive contaminants into the open environment is an assault on life wherever it's found. When this planet was very young, it was altogether too radioactive to permit the emergence of mammals and eventually humans. Only as it began to cool off radiologically, only as those elements began to decay, were warm-blooded species and mammals and eventually human beings able to emerge. We are probably the most radio-sensitive creatures on the planet. Our genetic makeup is a large and complex target for ionizing radiation, and that renders us particularly susceptible, especially when our cells are rapidly multiplying as we are a fetus and then as an infant. And so they are the ones that are most vulnerable. I think that there may have been a time, this is my own personal poetic take on things, the artist's take, but I do think that there may have been a time in the way back, in the primordial era, when human beings were capable of detecting ionizing radiation, even as we are now capable of detecting sound waves or light waves. But as that background became less and less radioactive, I think maybe have become less and less sensitive. And so now we can't smell it, hear it, see it, taste it, touch it. But almost universally, we don't like it. Almost universally, we have a reaction of repugnance. I personally believe that this intuitive aversion to ionizing radiation is not a defect of our intellect. It is a survival mechanism left over from the days of our dawning on this planet. And I do think that that, rather than the textbooks, should inform our research into ionizing radiation. Here, in this community, We've seen the shutdown of a full-size nuclear station, 600 some megawatts electric, which each day would produce enough radiotoxins to wipe out life on the earth. That's the radical statement. That's the extreme statement, but that's the true statement. However many ounces of plutonium, how many ever pounds of fission products, were it introduced into the biosphere, into living creatures, would mean the end of them. And not, by the way, a graceful quick end, but a very slow, laborious tearing down of living fabric. So that's why we're here. I hope that answer your question. Yeah. Because if we don't do something to ensure that the cleanup of this site is the best that it can possibly be, nobody else will. Nobody else will. They don't have the incentive. They don't have the information. They don't have the moral weapons to bring to bear. And so unless we do something, something will not happen, and the site will be left a contaminated site, much worse than it needs to be. And the contaminants, and I said this last year, the contaminants are the full range of reactor-produced radioactive materials. They are no different when you stretch them out and you say, this is the set, these are the salt and peppers over here, here's the creamer, here's the saucer, here's, this is the set of radioactive contaminants is no different than those contaminants that presently offend life at Chernobyl or at Fukushima. Same. It is the same material. It is not as dense, it's not as concentrated, but nonetheless, each one, as it comes in contact with light, offends in the same way. And that's what we have to deal with. That's why we have to make sure that what we leave here, our bequest to future generations of all living things, is as clean as we can possibly make it. Remedy the damage that has been done to the greatest extent possible. It's important. I'll close this gloomy portion of the evening with a quote from Carl Z. Morgan. Carl Z. Morgan was a radiation researcher, and he is the father of the discipline of health physics, which is the discipline of radiation protection in the United States, founder of the American Health Physics Society. And he said to one of his students, boy, I'll tell you how important this is. One photon can kill you. One emission from a beta emitter, strontium-90 or whatever. I think Morgan was trying to say we should not get into playing statistical games. It is not about how many chances in 1,000 or chances in 100 or whether this dose compares to a high-altitude plane ride across the United States, or a dental x-ray, or whatever it may be. This dose, however small, wherever it is an anti-life projectile. Simple as that. So we need to take that seriously, I think. Anyway, that's the why we're here. Okay. So, look, there's a question.
Questions?
A
Can
comment.
you, in a few words, Ray, sum up what you did in St. Petersburg, what the theme of the meeting was?
Fess up.
And how many people were there? I'm just curious to know how big a gathering it was.
Yeah. So I just got back from St. Petersburg. I just got back from St. Petersburg, Russia, where I presented at an international conference on decommissioning. It was sponsored by a brand new limited liability corporation called Decommission, LLC. Very nice style, as Russians have. And it was attended by legislators, Russian legislators, by Russian scientists who had been involved in nuclear waste studies and in decommissioning studies. Some who had been to the U.S. to study under National Academies of Science purview, and lead engineers from the Ignalina nuclear plant in Lithuania, which is undergoing decommissioning. That's a RBMK style reactor, which, as you all know, is the Chernobyl style of reactor, which is moderated with graphite. The core of this reactor is packed with monster blocks of graphite, and it's cooled with water. At the end of the day, the graphite becomes irradiated, contaminated, there's a difference, and really nasty to handle, and there's tons of it. So their decommissioning is a little more complicated than ours. So those guys were there, and there were officials of Rosatom, which is now a stockholder corporation. It used to be the sole state monopoly nuclear company of Russia. Now it's the sole privately held state monopoly nuclear company of Russia. So yeah, so we had those folks there. I went in tandem with an old friend of mine who also presented. He's the past president of Maine Yankee Atomic Power Company. He was my principal sparring partner when it came to negotiating the decommissioning of Maine Yankee. And that, I should mention as a side note, was a plant that was decommissioned on time, on budget, below budget for radiation exposure to the workers, and to probably the cleanest of cleanup standards of any plant to that point in the country. And all of that, most of it, was negotiated with members of the community and also c'est moi. Meisner and I did side-by-side presentations, and what we presented on was the importance of community involvement in nuclear power plant decommissioning and its benefits to the community, to the decommissioning company, and to regulators. And I was surprised at times when Mike Meisner, a lifetime nuclear supporter, told the Rosatom officials, I was begging him, please, Mike, don't point the finger at them. He was doing it. He said, I want Rosatom to understand, if you people are going to try to sell nuclear power plants around the world, that even though it may not play well in Russia, out there in the world, it's the coming thing, you're going to have to get used to community input and community involvement. Take my word for it. So, so that was our fun adventure in Russia.
How many people attended, Ray?
We had about 40 at peak. We had an incident in the middle of it was a 3-day thing, and we had an incident in the middle of it in which these guys burst into the room. The two doors blew open. Big guys came in uniform. Russian security police, everybody stay seated. And they hauled off one of our speakers, dragged him off from the front of the room, and one of our attorneys went with him. He was released about 4 or 5 hours later. It's had some visa irregularity. But the activists in the room said, well, that's Russia for you. They said they just wanted to let us know that they were really in charge and they could do whatever they wanted. That was the message. So that was fun. These people are very brave and very strong. The leader of this group that invited us was beaten walking home from a meeting, clubbed, waylaid with pipes so badly that he spent 26 days in the hospital. The group itself managed to wangle funding from the U.S. State Department for some of the adventures we've been on, including this one. My airfare was paid through a Hayes Fulbright grant from the U.S. State Department. And when officialdom found out about that, they took away their nonprofit status, billed them for all the benefits they had ever gotten, some $50,000 worth, and had them declared as registered foreign agents. So, these people are they're not going to walk out of here and go down on Main Street and be relaxed and, have a beer and no worries. They face a far different atmosphere than we face. Nobody should ever be afraid to speak up about nuclear power in the United States. Believe me, nothing is going to befall you.
Thanks, Ray.
Thank you, Ray.
Next up, Arnie Gunderson, Chief Technical Advisor to Fairwinds, what is it now? Fairwinds Education? Fairwinds Energy Education. Just back from Fukushima, from Japan. I'll let him elaborate. It's more than I can grasp.
Very good. Hi. Thank you for having me today. And I want to thank the New England Coalition for sponsoring this event, but more importantly, for being so tenacious for so long. We're talking about 1971 when we got started. But my hat's off to you. Once again, the coalition has asked Fairwinds to team up with it to argue about another ill-conceived idea from Entergy. We focus this time on the problems associated with rubblization at Vermont Yankee, the problems of a limited liability corporation at Vermont Yankee, and the problems of an absolutely inexperienced potential new owner at Vermont Yankee. Thank you for the trust that you have put in Maggie and I to continue to work with the coalition. And last shout out before I really get into the speeches, I want to thank Maggie. The conversation today is about the contamination in Japan, and she funded 4 crowdsourced trips for me to go over to Japan to get this data. And you know, without that, I wouldn't be up here. So I've been asked to update you about the contamination in Japan from Fukushima. But rather than focus on a country and a plant that's half a world away, I want to look at the similarities between that plant and Vermont Yankee and those towns and Brattleboro. There's amazing similarities between the two. I'm sure you know that the Fukushima reactors are identical to the reactor at Vermont Yankee. The same miserable containment at Fukushima is the containment at Vermont Yankee. It's susceptible to the same kinds of problems, something called the loop, the loss of offsite power, and something called the Lewis, the loss of the ultimate heat sink. Those problems that torpedoed Fukushima are the same problems that Vermont Yankee is susceptible to. In addition to the similarities between the plants, I'm taken by the similarities in the towns and in the area. The contaminated zone in Fukushima is essentially from Springfield, Vermont to Springfield, Massachusetts, and maybe 20 miles on either side of the river. Imagine a strip about that long that's so contaminated, I wouldn't want to live there. And the town of Brattleboro is so similar to a town called Minami-Soma that I'll talk about a little bit later. So there's both the similarities, the people and the community and the power plant. In September of this year, I spent 2 weeks in Japan. It was my 4th trip there, and I went this time with Dr. Marco Kaltofen of Worcester Polytechnic. And we collected samples that are going to be analyzed by a dozen grad students at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. So I thought I'd use the brief time I have to talk about the 4 trips I've taken to Japan, and it totals about two months on the ground there. First though, there's been a massive cover-up by governments and the nuclear industry around the world, not just in Japan, around the world, about the consequences of Fukushima disaster. But have no doubt that in the week immediately after the disaster, governments did realize just how bad it was. March 20th, NRC email surfaced. NRC is Nuclear Regulatory Commission. NRC email surfaced and it said, quote, all of northern Japan is an RCA. And the press missed it. And probably a lot of people in this room are. What's an RCA? An RCA is a radiologically contaminated area. What does that mean? It means that if it were in a power plant, you'd have some really stringent requirements about entering the RCA and exiting the RCA. Really stringent radiological controls. Well, what did the Japanese do about their RCA? The standards for the people in Japan were 100 millirems before the accident, before the disaster. What did the Japanese do? They raised the standard to 20 times higher. So rather than treat this thing as a serious radiological contamination, they raised the standards 20 times and told people they could go back home. If northern Japan were a nuclear power plant, you'd have to wear rubber gloves, you'd have to wear booties, you'd have to wear respirators. And when you vacuumed the floor in your house, you'd have to ship the vacuum cleaner bag to a nuclear waste dump. And yet, the world doesn't understand that, nor do the Japanese people. All of northern Japan is an RCA. So my first trip to Japan was in February of 2012. It was on a book tour for the best-selling book that Maggie and I wrote. It's only in Japanese, sorry. I took samples 5 times in 5 days in Tokyo. And Tokyo is 140 miles away from Fukushima. Every one of those samples would qualify as radioactive waste if it came from a nuclear power plant, and would have to be shipped to Texas. The second trip, it was in September of 2012. It was a university speaking tour, and it lasted 10 days. I didn't take any samples, but that was the moment that I really understood the depth of distrust that the Japanese have toward, one, their government, and 2, Tokyo Electric. Almost every Japanese woman, and about half the men don't want nuclear power in Japan. So that's 75% of the population doesn't want nuclear power in Japan. Yet, as I speak today, the Japanese government is starting up nuclear power plants. I met a woman in Western Japan who thanked me for saving her marriage. She had lived in Eastern Japan, in Fukushima Prefecture, and she said, I'm out of here, I'm taking the kids, and she left. Her husband threatened divorce. And she said to him, I want you to do one thing before you divorce me. I want you to listen to Fairwinds. And he left, and he went with her, and they're happily married even now. It was one positive success of Fairwinds I have. The next time I was in Japan was February and March of 2016, last year, and I was there for 30 days. I witnessed 30 million bags of radioactive nuclear waste. And these bags, maybe you've seen them, they're a foot, 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, and they weigh about a ton. 30 million tons of nuclear waste spread about throughout the prefecture. One of the most poignant photographs I've ever seen is a hillside in beautiful color from the cherry blossoms. And at the base of the hillside is a pile of nuclear radioactive waste. Those 30 million bags only represent cleaning up about 5% of the prefecture. So multiply that 20 times if they really wanted to clean it up. What they've done in a town like this, they would clean the streets and clean about 30 feet on either side of the street, but the mountains and the hillsides they're not cleaning. And yet they've generated 30 million bags of nuclear waste. I visited a town called Minami-Soma, which reminds me a lot of Brattleboro. I was in the town hall. The town hall had been completely cleaned. The roof had been, a new epoxy roof had been put on, and it was cleared for occupancy. And the entire town was invited back too, because it was completely clean. And I sampled on that roof, and I found highly radioactive dirt scattered throughout the entire roof. In fact, what was happening was the radiation was blowing out of the mountains and recontaminating the town. One of the saddest things I saw were little girls on their way to school riding bicycles through the dust. They don't know what they're getting into. All the people in that town have been told it's safe to return, and most of them have believed the government and have returned. I took 100 samples while I was there, radioactive samples, and I gave 50 speeches in 30 days. It was a busy time. I held meetings with moms. This is probably the saddest part of the trip, who had left Fukushima Prefecture with their kids. And their husbands were suing them for divorce, and they wanted the kids to go back home to Fukushima Prefecture. The courts, because the government supports the fathers, were sending the kids back home. And I told the mothers, I said, well, at least for 5 formative years when these kids are growing up, you've got them away from that radiation. I met a doctor named Dr. Mehdi. He's been diagnosing radiation illnesses in Fukushima Prefecture. Now, the Japanese government refused to pay his bills unless he changed them from a radiation sickness to stress. And Dr. Mehdi refused, and his practice was closed. But he still had his integrity. Well, that trip, this is the trip last year, the 30-day trip with 100 samples, led to a peer-reviewed report, scientific paper I wrote, co-authored with Dr. Marco Kaltofman at Worcester Polytechnic. And it directly impacts what's happening here in Brattleboro. The data and conclusions we reached in that report are now, that report is now in the top 3% of scientific studies that have ever been written. And the dose consequences are pretty incredible. Let me give you a little background about what that report is, because I think it's important for the Vermont Yankee decommissioning. First, a little bit about math. There's a term called the median. And just think of a highway, what do you call the strip in the middle of the road, the median? So the median when you're collecting data is if you put all the samples, all the data from the lowest all the way, rank them up to the highest, the median is the one in the middle. So we had 180 radioactive samples in our batch. So the 90th sample is the median. Then the other term is the mean, and the mean is the average. We just add up all 90 with the total to it, divide by 90, and that's the mean. So median is the middle of the data, and mean is the average. So one other term, and then I'll be off the geek stuff. There's a term called becquerels per kilogram, and that's a measure of how much radiation is in a hunk of dirt or in a piece of your body or whatever. A becquerel is when one atom disintegrates and sends off ionizing radiation every second. So it's one disintegration that sends off a gamma ray or a beta ray or an alpha ray. One disintegration every second, that's a becquerel. And a becquerel per kilogram kilograms about 2 pounds. So if I had a 2-pound piece of something, it would be disintegrating at about 1 disintegration per second if we measured it at 1 becquerel per kilogram. Well, our report shows that in the US, the average hunk of dirt disintegrates at about 3 becquerels per kilogram. In Japan, our report shows that the median, the middle of our data, disintegrates at 3,000 disintegrations per. And that's 1,000 times higher than in the United States. That's pretty bad. But what's even worse is that the average was 27,000, which means that there are some low levels, but there's some extraordinarily high levels too. So the most shocking thing in this report was that 5% of the particles were 10,000 times higher than the middle number. The radiation was 10,000 times higher. Now what does that mean? It means that the International Atomic Energy Agency is miscalculating the dose to people in Japan. Those people that get that, those hot particles, those 10,000 times the average, those 5% of those particles we know are out there, are exposed to much more radiation than the standard dose model that the Japanese are assuming for their population. And certainly the danger to those people is significantly greater
Were they
than
taken in the vicinity of a plant or in the...
all throughout Japan, throughout the prefecture and throughout Japan.
In non-controlled areas?
None of them were in the plant controlled area. None of them were in the plant. They were all out tromping through.
In habitable areas?
Yeah, all of these were taken in habitable areas. We had permission to go wherever we went, and like the Minami-Soma Town Hall, there were kids on the street. Yeah. So now, what does that mean for a Vermont Yankee? And I think for dose calculations in general, when there's particulates being released, is that a significant number of those particles are smaller and much more highly radioactive than the standard dose model allows. And what that means is that let's look at rubbleization from my Yankee. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's like grinding coffee beans, but it throws off a lot of dust. That dust is going to go somewhere, maybe over to the grammar school. Or that dust is going to wind up in the groundwater. Particles in that dust are going to be 10,000 times more radioactive than the standard dose model assumes. What it tells me is that the Vermont Yankee site will be unusable if rubbleization is used for a couple of 100 years. So last month, that was the report from my trip a year ago. Last month, Dr. Kaltofen and I were in Fukushima Prefecture for 2 weeks. It was my 4th trip, it was his 1st. We were teaching citizens and scientists to how to take radiation samples. The citizen scientists collected about more than 130 samples weighing about 10 pounds. That dirt and dust was transferred to Worcester Polytechnic Institute for analysis. Until we've got the papers issued, I can't talk about the specific locations, nor can I discuss the magnitude of the radiation that we detected. We got to get the reports out from a scientific standpoint. You can't give the information out until you've issued a scientific report. But I can say this. We tested a schoolyard where kids are going to school right now. And the radiation in that schoolyard was 70 times higher than what it is in Vermont. It was just, it gives me goosebumps just thinking about it right now. It's so incredible. Again, we went back to the Minami-Soma Town Hall, areas that I had cleaned a year ago, that they had cleaned 2 years before that, had become recontaminated yet again. When we complete these studies, Worcester Polytechnic will take that 10 pounds of dirt and they'll ship it to Texas or to an approved nuclear waste disposal dump here in the States. It's going to cost Worcester Poly $3,000 to send 10 pounds of dirt to Texas. And the Japanese have 30 million tons of waste in bags.
Too cheap to meter.
Too cheap to meter. I can, okay, so I came away understanding that the Japanese population is just shell-shocked. They just want it to be over. And of course, it's never going to be over. You know, we all know when Chernobyl happened, but when did it end? You still can't, use the milk from the cows in Wales in the middle of England. You still can't use the wild boar in Sweden or Germany. But we all know when these things began, but we don't know when they ended. So the population is shell-shocked and wants it to end. The government is ignoring the voices of the people. It's still about 70% of the people don't want nuclear power plants to start up, and yet they start up. I suggest to you to follow the money. Whether it's here in Japan, or whether it's here or in Japan, the money trail leads you to powerful corporations that put profits before the health and the people of their communities. At Fairwinds, we'll continue to keep you informed by continuing to speak truth to power. Let me just follow up. Paul asked where were the samples taken. There's an interactive data map on the Fairwinds site that you can go to, and you can click on the particular sample, and it'll take you right to a picture, a pin that you can then hone in on to find the picture of the exact location. I'm talking about the drain on the side of the road where the water runs, or the middle of a Walmart parking lot that had a little low spot, and I picked up a sample of dirt that was sitting there. We didn't get anywhere near Fukushima. The Tokyo Electric wouldn't let us. And yet these samples were astronomical. The biggest sample we had was from Nagoya. And Nagoya is 300 miles away. Somebody sent us a vacuum cleaner bag. And the vacuum cleaner bag had a sample in it that was essentially a piece of nuclear fuel. It had blown in the wind 300 miles, and we picked it up in this vacuum cleaner bag. So and the particle was 9 microns, 9 millionths of a meter, incredibly small particle. And that we found 300 miles away from Fukushima. So these samples are not at the site, but they're scattered all over. Yeah, you had a question? Yes?
Yeah, I've been staying away from seafood ever since then. And, I was hoping for an update on the state of the oceans and radioactivity in seafood. And I'm just assuming that anything out of the Pacific is not safe to eat, and probably the other oceans have become somewhat contaminated as well.
Yeah. Yeah. When I'm in Japan, I don't eat seafood. That's my rule of thumb. But that's a personal decision for me, not based on, I'm not a doctor, so I can't do that. There's contamination in the Pacific. It's been detected as far as 20 miles off of San Francisco, and it's 10 becquerels per cubic meter. So, 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet is disintegrating at there's about 10 sparks of radiation every second off of Fukushima. They've also picked up relatively low levels of cesium in salmon up in Alaska, about 3 to 5 becquerels per kilogram. The Japanese standard for whether or not it's edible or not is 100 becquerels per kilogram. And the American standard, these guys are really looking out for us, is 1,200. The American standard is 12 times higher than the Japanese. So what the Japanese can't eat, they can ship to America. Yeah. So, but the whatever's in the Pacific from Fukushima has not made it into the Atlantic or Indian Ocean. And most of it hasn't even gotten below the equator yet. It moves across from Japan, across the Aleutian Islands, down Vancouver and Seattle and down to San Francisco, and keeps heading south. And really, it hasn't gotten to the equator yet. But Woods Hole just discovered radiation 60 miles away from Fukushima in the sand, down 4 feet, which was a real surprise to a lot of scientists. And I'm hoping to go back and confirm that. So my attitude is, I personally, when I'm in Japan, I don't eat any fish because I have no idea where it's coming from. And I will source my fish in America and try to eat Atlantic fish as opposed to Pacific fish.
Well, tuna being an apex predator.
Well, yeah, tuna is a different deal. It's the same deal though. It's building up. It's mercury.
Right.
In tuna, the mercury from burning of coal winds up in the water and it works its way up and gets into the tuna. The same thing happens with cesium. So these apex predators, like the salmon and things like that, are showing signs of Fukushima radiation in the Pacific, but not in the Atlantic. On the other hand, if you look at the reprocessing plants that the Brits have in Cumbria, that's contaminated the Irish Sea, and the reprocessing plant that the French have on the North Sea has contaminated the North Sea. So, Ray was talking about it. We're talking about you can run, but you can't hide. It's everywhere.
Well, the debris was washing up on the...
There's a couple more questions here. Let's
keep going.
so we get a dialogue going here. Any? Yes.
Hi, I just am curious, when I saw the truthful Scott State speaking recently, Melissa was there, and he was asked about rubblization, I think I asked her, and nobody's saying, how do they, it's like, how do you determine what is clean, what is contaminated and what's not, and, it's like they are proprietary about it, and then I went outside and some guy who either currently or formerly worked at the VY plant gave me some line about how they can basically do this sort of scraping or sandblasting process to get the outside contaminated part of the concrete off of the concrete that they're gonna rubbleize? It sounded like a lot of baloney. I'm just curious if, you know, and who would be measuring it? Like, do you have you heard anything about how they're considering doing this and determining what is quote safe to rubbleize?
Well, maybe Ray and I can talk in detail afterward, but what happens at a nuclear plant, if you get contamination down and the plant is still running, frequently they'll epoxy over it, just trap it down. But now you're at a point where you've got to ship it off-site, and so you've got to get at that contamination. There's what they plan to do at Vermont Yankee is something called scabble, which is like when they tear up a road, you know, those things with teeth that chip up the top surface of the road, and then they would claim that what's left behind is not contaminated anymore. There's lots of problems with that, and one is that you're measuring that contamination in a contaminated building. So how do you know what that contamination is? It actually turns out that it's cheaper not to rubbleize, because what happens is that I've got a crew of people waiting to tear that concrete out. I've got, you know, machines and equipment waiting. Meanwhile, I'm taking a sample, it goes off to the lab, it gets approved, and days go by. So a lot of people are waiting a long time before they can tear it up. So our position is to just take it out in large blocks. Don't even try to grind it up and ship it to an approved dump. That's what's happening at Zion. The only other plant that's roughly similar to Vermont Yankee is Zion. And at Zion, they're shipping the material to Utah. And they're making the determination in Utah whether or not it can be used as construction material or whether it has to be dumped in the ground. There's a lot of problems about measuring radioactivity in a contaminated environment.
That's kind of what I was thinking, but I'm not technical.
Yeah, no, you're technical enough to understand it, yeah. Yeah, Maggie, and then I'm done. I should yield the floor.
Well, when you and Martha returned from Japan, one of the things you both told me is that the rubbleization process would cause a dust that can migrate anywhere. And that dust, those dust particles, as you said, at NAMI from Fukushima, that migrated 300 miles, or 150 miles, I guess it was.
No,
300 miles. So this dust could migrate all around this part of Vermont and into Massachusetts and New Hampshire and be washed into the Connecticut River, go into lakes, streams, into vegetable gardens. I mean, that's what's going to happen with rubbleization. Isn't that true? That's what I understood from Dr.
Yeah.
Kaltofen.
Let me expand on it. Everything you said is absolutely right. You know, if you think of a cube of sugar and you drop it into water, and then you grind up a cube of sugar and you drop it into water, which one's going to dissolve first? You know, it's going to be the ground up fines. So that's part of it. But the other part is, if I start with a big cube and I've got a radioactive particle in the middle, well, that radiation is absorbed by the cube itself and doesn't ever get out. But when you rubbleize that, you have the same amount of radiation that's in that cube now has a lot greater surface area to escape from. And there's much less shielding. And that's really what Marco and I found, is that these particles are more susceptible to leave the material because their particle size is so phenomenally small. And when you rubbleize that dust, you'll create a situation where particles that normally would be trapped in that big block are just, you know, free to go to the grammar school if they want. Yeah.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to introduce our speaker today. Dave Kraft is legend in our industry. I hesitate to call what we do that, but in some measure it is. With 7 other, I'm going to read most of this here, with 7 other environmental, and his vitae, it goes on and it's ridiculous. With 7 other environmental activists, David founded the Nuclear Energy Information Service, NEIS, in 1981 to provide the public with reliable information about nuclear power and radiation hazards and energy alternatives to nuclear power. He's currently the director of the organization. I might point out that there are 11 operating plants in Illinois that David and his organization at least are paying attention to. But David's work goes much beyond that. He's given presentations about nuclear power hazards, alternative energy, and other environmental issues to every academic grade level from 2nd grade through graduate school after work on the 1st grade. He was a presenter at Student Environmental Action Coalition's national meetings in 1990, 91, ECHO Conference 2000.
Get to the chase.
Okay, cut to the chase. He's widely published articles and opinion pieces in local and regional publications, appears frequently in Chicago area and Illinois radio and television. He spearheaded the drafting of the 2020 Energy Vision, the Illinois Environmental Community Alternative to the Bush-Cheney National Energy Plan of 2001. He's the author of the October 2000 report, Here Today, There Tomorrow, Commercial Nuclear Reactor Sites as Terrorist Targets. He's working on a new, more comprehensive report entitled, You Can't Nuke Global Warming, Why Nuclear Power Cannot Mitigate Global Warming Effects. David has served as a member of countless advisor groups and task forces, National Nuclear Waste Citizens Coalition, Evanston Energy Alternatives Task Force. He was co-organizer for the International World Depleted Uranium Weapons Conference held in Hamburg, Germany, and more recently, Nuclear Power and Children's Health, Citizens Epidemiology, The Next Step, Chernobyl Plus 20, Remembrance for the Future, and and most recently, in 2017, he received the Judith Johnsford Unsung Hero Award for his lifelong work for a less nuclear world. We sing his praises here and thank him for being here today. Thanks.
Thank you, Skylar. And thank you all for inviting me here. I was a little skeptical about taking this gig on at first. I didn't know what Skylar had in mind. I didn't know what you had in mind. And I'm always mindful of the Groucho Marx warning that I never want to be a speaker in front of a group that would have someone like me as a speaker. So I was a little reticent about coming, but I am glad I'm here. I don't get to New England very often. This is a real treat. I'm really glad to meet you folks, except there are too many silver and gray hair people here. We need to get some younger folks in. What I'm going to try and do today is weave together 3 presentations I do, and also I'll be painting broad brush strokes. So some of this might be very familiar to many of you, but it's with the idea that we need to have a gestalt on these issues of decommissioning, radioactive waste, Yucca Mountain, and all that. And that's really what I'm here to try and do, is to give you the lay of the land from my perspective, from the perspective of the people I work with locally and in Washington, to get to that. So unfortunately, my remarks will probably, in many cases, leave you feeling worse than the remarks from Ray and from Arnie. So I apologize for that in advance. Back home, they call my presentations the Davy Downer shows. So we'll do the best we can. I hope to lift you up at the end. Also, a little commercial announcement. There's a table back there with materials which supplement many of the remarks I'll have today and actually have part of the presentation. So make sure you take that before you go today. So I have good news, bad news for you. This is the show for the day is that the nuclear age is over. That's the good news. The bad news is we're now left entering the age of decommissioning. Next. And as we enter that age, it's really important to remember something that a guy a lot smarter than most of us in this room once said, in terms of reality versus, the constructs, the best possible cases. And this certainly got played out in the case of the nuclear age. I'm afraid it may get played out in the context of the age of decommissioning as well. That the way you think things are going to turn out aren't necessarily so. And that's something we always need to keep in mind. But we always need to remind our opposition of that as well, and people we deal with. Next. So as I said, it's a great day. The nuclear age is over. And I'm going to run through a bunch of slides real fast for you to kind of prove it. Go ahead. This is what we have as of today. Only 99 operating, only 450 in the world. Some of you might remember Richard Nixon wanted 1,000 reactors along the coast of California. Well, he's a little short, And the other part of the good news is that while there are reactors that are under construction, there are far more slated for closure worldwide. So I think that's one trend. Next. This is an example of a PowerPoint slide you should never ever use because you can't read it. And that's why I put it in here to kind of instruct you folks. But the important part of the slide is that little curve on the right. You'll notice that there's a straight line between two parts of the curve, and a smaller portion, smaller group curves off to the right, a larger portion curves off to the left. The ones curving off to the left are the ones that a study at MIT have calculated are going to become unprofitable in the next 10 or 20 years. In other words, 2/3 of the reactors out there will be becoming unprofitable, and we'll get to what that means in a minute here. So another evidence that the nuclear age is over. Fading fast, overruns everywhere, as you'll see in a moment. Small modular designs aren't really working out as planned. And of course, the legendary, we have no place to put the garbage. Next. These are just some more statistics here. Keep going, one more. So here are some of the ones that bit the dust recently. You're probably aware of the $18 billion VC summer disaster that got canceled. Next. And Georgia Power has finally upped its estimate for the Vogtle plants to $27 billion. Next. Duke didn't want to go that far. They pulled out even before I could get numbers up on the slide. So that's good news. And the next one is that the legendary Westinghouse company has totally bankrupted Toshiba as a result of nuclear power, and they're not going to be doing nuclear power anymore as a product. So what does a rugged, individualistic captain of industry, capitalist industry do when confronted with these facts? They of course turn to the government for bailouts, and you guys follow the news, you've seen it happening. We endured it in Illinois recently, we see it happening in New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio. They're coming after the bailouts, and I can't even keep my slideshow up to date because some of you may be aware that Secretary of Perry has instructed or asked the FERC to institute national bailouts, not just for nuclear plants, but for uneconomic coal plants. So much for capitalism. So that's what you do in this age of decommissioning. So now we get to the good stuff. Where are we heading to? So we'll go through this kind of quick too. Next. This is from the NRC website. They do some things good. This is a pretty good slide, so it gives you an idea where things are. That collection of measles in the middle is Illinois. As Skylar said, we have 11 operating plants, but we also have 3 that are shut down. So we have 14 reactors overall. Currently in the world, if we were a world power, Illinois would be the 10th largest nuclear power on the planet, just behind the United Kingdom and Ukraine. And nobody wants to be behind Ukraine these days. So next. Here's a list of the plants that have already been closed or announced closures and need decontamination and decommissioning. Vermont, Yankee, and Zion are at the bottom of the list, so that's why I'm here, I guess. Next. So, this, the industry has 3 choices. You tear it apart, you store it forever, or you cover it over. And we're in the tearing apart philosophy, apparently, both in Illinois here and in Vermont. Next. I tell people and tell audiences it's very important as we move into the age of decommissioning to be very clear on the distinction between disposal of high-level radioactive waste and storage of high-level radioactive waste. This is a very important legal distinction written into the 1981 law, and you'll see that the reporters frequently interchange these. You'll even see some of our environmental colleagues use the two very carelessly. So I'm kind of cautioning you to be very precise in your language, and particularly on these 2 words. Disposal, permanent. Storage, allegedly temporary. So, next. So, what does the age of decommissioning leave us? Currently, about 75 to 80,000 tons of high-level waste scattered around the 70-plus sites around the United States. And it's also important to mention to folks that while some parts of the nuclear industry are urging the fact that we have a crisis, we have this radioactive waste, we have to have a place to put it, centralized interim storage, Yucca Mountain. In the very same year, a report was issued by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission saying the wastes are perfectly safe on site for 100 years. So the question to ask regulators, public utility commissions, reporters is, which time was NRC lying? They're two incompatible statements, so you have to really point that out. This is another one of those very bad PowerPoint graphics, and the good news is there's a sheet on the table, you can take this home with you. Because legislators sometimes have an attention span and understanding value that fit about here, I put into a graphic format what the age of decommissioning looks like. Essentially, a reactor closes, the spent fuel is orphaned, it's got to stay somewhere, stage 3, and it's got to be disposed of, stage 4. The difference here, though, is between what the industry and government wants to do and what the rest of us as environmental and world-conscious people want to do. Those folks want to close reactors. The spent fuel will sit around on these, we call them bowling pin pads at the dry casks at the facilities like Zion and elsewhere, because they're lined up very neatly, painted white, targets on the top. And from that particular configuration, they're supposed to go into indefinite storage somewhere. And as many of you know, the current somewheres under consideration are in West Texas, Southeast New Mexico. And what we point out to our Illinois legislators, this is something, a little factoid not many people know, was that in 2012, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory ran a computer simulation of what would be optimal locations for centralized interim storage facilities. And they started out with the first facility being allocated specifically for reactors that are orphaned. The waste is orphaned. The reactors are closed, whether they're torn down or not. So it turns out that when they ran their computer simulation, they would modify different parameters like miles traveled, proximity to population centers, all this kind of stuff. In about 14 out of 15 simulations, the optimal location for a single CIS for the orphan facilities is in north central Illinois, which really gets the attention of our delegation all of a sudden. I don't know about you guys. So we point that out. And that's what the government wants to do. They want the CIS sites, and then as you also know, one of our brain-damaged representatives in the Illinois delegation is now pushing to get money again for the Yucca Mountain project. So that's their final disposal. Ours is the bottom. And that's what we're going to get into in some detail here. And we'll see what details match up for Vermont Yankee, Zion, and some of the other locations. We want the reactors closed. Hell, we didn't want them open to begin with. But we want them closed. We don't want any bailouts. We want to enact what's called just transitions for communities, especially the communities that have operating reactors, so that you can create a pool of money in advance of closure, which would guarantee that the tax base would be protected, public services would not be disrupted, and workers would have a chance to get a new economy located locally. We also want the waste communities, the ones that are left with the orphan waste, to be compensated for becoming a de facto radioactive waste dump, which they did not sign up to. Second thing we want, the spent fuel, we wanted to put on-site in hardened on-site storage, and I'll get into some detail of that a little bit later. So I think most of you are familiar with that concept. And again, we point out that it's a good idea because the NRC says it can stay there for 100 years that way. Rah, rah. Third phase, the indefinite storage. Well, for us, that drops out. There is no centralized interim storage. We want hardened on-site storage on site. We need to make whole the communities that are economically disrupted in that period, and then we need to do real science to select the fourth phase, the permanent geological repository. If it is geological, we may not know, but we certainly haven't done science in selecting Yucca Mountain. Okay, so that's the contrast, and it seems like the staffers at least get this, and they like the fact that it's in a pretty graphic because they deal with graphics and bullet points. Paragraphs, their mind explodes. Next. So, industry game plan. Well, as we started out, you know, they want bailouts for the old reactors, they want CIS, they want yucca, and here's the thing that doesn't get talked about a lot, but it's suspected heavily. Why would you want a centralized interim storage facility somewhere to bring all the waste to? Well, it might be a very convenient location to try and resurrect a reprocessing technology of some kind, because you got all the raw materials coming to you. You can demonstrate to your constituents that, you see, we solved the radioactive waste problem, it's out of your community, bring it on to, you know, wherever, and we will reprocess it, which of course is a benign process, right, Ernie?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is a suspicion that reprocessing is a quietly intended focus for the centralized interim storage plants. They want to build new reactors, and of course they want them to be small and modular. This is our plan, and unfortunately it does sound like a temper tantrum, but it is very important that people with conscience, who have some sort of soul and a sense of justice, say no to something that is incredibly stupid and unreasonable. And that's our job. I don't have to tell you that. So we don't want bailouts or CIS or yucca or reprocessing or new reactors. We have a better plan. So, what's wrong with bailouts? Anybody? Quick? No, I thought so. Okay. Well, for those libertarians amongst you, I know that the whole idea of private enterprise, you know, privately owned companies receiving government largesse is really makes you queasy. But, you know, we have to make this point that bailouts are not the way to go, in spite of Commissioner Perry. Next. Decommissioning. Now here's where some of the details come in, and I'll get into this in the second part of the presentation. Over our last 7 or 8 years that we've been dealing with Zion, we have encountered just, again, mind-boggling anomalies, problems, issues that, of course, they just disregard, just like they've disregarded many of your issues here in Vermont. They're somewhat different for our case in Zion than for yours, but overall it's that whole idea of those folks disregard rationality. And so we found, for example, that same as you, there is no transparency, there's nothing independent about either overseeing the site or the process involved. We've resurrected, once again, notions that the GAO has brought up in the past, that the funding formulas that the NRC uses to create the decommissioning pools are inadequate, and they don't match real life in some ways. Beyond that, we found some other financial irregularities which make our state legislators' jaws drop and reveal what they are. For example, the NRC, in spite of the fact that it says money is the key to doing a safe and thorough decommissioning, does not require any vendors doing decommissioning to have an auditor, or do an audit, or subscribe to United States GAAP, General Accounting Practices and Principles. We have a guy running for governor in Illinois now, Chris Kennedy. The name might be familiar here. Anyway, when we told this to him, he's a businessman, you know, but we don't require this for $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion worth of public money that's been set aside somehow to do decommissioning. You know, the waste issue, that's still unresolved. And interestingly enough, the NRC in some of our proceedings, we kind of peppered them with questions. They can't even demonstrate that the technology and the machinery necessary to do a thorough and safe decommissioning actually physically exists. They talk about what would happen, for example, if you break up the spent fuel pool, you set up the dry casks, and then there's an emergency where you have to deal with the damaged dry cask and move it or whatever. Well, of course, to do the transfer, you need some sort of wet pool or some sort of thing to protect the workers and the environment. So they claim that they require these things called hot cells. So we asked them at a public meeting, what company manufactures the hot cells? Well, we don't keep a list. Where are they? How many are there? Well, we don't know, but our requirements are such that the utility has to. So we don't even know if the stuff they're requiring exists on planet Earth. Okay, it might as well be on the Starship Enterprise for all we know. So these are some of the anomalies we've encountered at Zion. Next. You know, what's wrong with CIS? Lots of things. And again, this is we have flyers over here. Take these with. These are summarized there. But the whole issue of creating yet another place that has to be contaminated and then decontaminated, moving stuff twice, moving it to areas of low income, probably racially sensitive areas, Native American sites, in the case of Texas and New Mexico, Hispanic site. It's the whole environmental justice issue all over again. We don't need CIS. So these are the things that we point out. Next. If you haven't seen this, this is a terrific map that Karen Haddon of Texas has provided. And again, it's on the handout back there. Take it with you. This shows the various routes, rail routes primarily, that would be utilized if the site in West Texas, that's that circle towards the bottom there in Texas, were open for a CIS. And as you can see, not only does Illinois have measles, but it seems to have a lot of cocaine tracks and stuff. A lot of rail going through Illinois. It's a real problem for us. So we show these maps. People like pictures, especially legislative staffers. So show them the maps. Next. And again, I already told you about the Oak Ridge report, so move on. What's wrong with yucca? How many of you have been working on yucca over the years? Show of hands, anybody? Okay. So you can educate the rest of them any old time. Again, we have a sheet back there and a map about Yucca Mountain. But my two favorite factoids about yucca, aside from the usual stuff, are the fact that when they actually were doing something that resembled science at Yucca Mountain, they determined that an element called chlorine-36 was found inside Yucca Mountain. Now, there are two sources for chlorine-36 in the universe. One is cosmic ray bursts, which are done in galaxies far, far away and would incinerate the Earth if they accidentally hit us. And the second is thermonuclear weapons tests. And it just so happens there's a location near Yucca Mountain that did those. So the anomaly here is, how did the chlorine get into the mountain? And there are only two choices. Either the Neanderthals were much more sophisticated than we realized, and years ago, somehow got, or Yucca Mountain may have pathways in and out. And if the chlorine-36 can get in, there's a very good chance that over the hundreds, thousands of years, the stuff that's in Yucca Mountain will get out. So that's one factoid we point out. The second one is more recent. Actually, the Secretary of the Air Force has publicly stated in the Nevada press that she believes that Yucca Mountain, if it's enacted the way they're proposing it, could be a national security threat. It would degrade the ability to do simulated air flight missions, and she thinks that would degrade national security. So I think that's kind of interesting, especially for the hardliners, to point out that the Secretary of Air Force isn't pleased with Yucca. And what are you going to do with the chlorine-36? So these are two little things, again, on the fact sheets. Use them when you can. Shipping routes again, maybe you've seen this. This is the updated map, and that's on the reverse side of our Yucca Mountain flyer. Well, let's skip this one. I think you can figure that out. So here's where we seg into the second part of the presentation. What should we be doing? I was invited in June to do a presentation amongst many, many more distinguished people than myself in New York. Some of you may know Manna Jo Green, and she and others are working on the Indian Point reactor situation, and they're very concerned about decommissioning and what's going to happen there. So she has been convening phone calls every couple of weeks, and she convened this session in June and intends to convene more sessions on decommissioning and the problems that result prior and during and after decommissioning. So she has raised this issue's visibility tremendously in her community. And this is, what you're going to hear now is some of the presentational things that I brought there, given the Zion experience that we had. Things that we saw that are needed, things that are missing, and where do we go? So this is where we start going with the broad brushstrokes, because what you should be feeling right about now is that decommissioning isn't a little box here, and Yucca Mountain's not a little box there, and CIS over here. This is a continuum. It's a continuum of process, it's a continuum of technology, and we have to examine it in a more kind of holistic gestalt way, because one of those boxes always affects the other in some capacity. So I want to start with decommissioning even before the reactors are closed. So the first thing that came up is the issue that you may hear this phrase in the future of just transitions. Anyone hear of this phrase? I'm just curious. Okay, a few of you. It's actually been around a while, but in the context of other environmental issues. What we're getting at here is that in the case of the nuclear industry, or even the coal industry, any extractive industry, when they close down, communities are in an uproar, because chances are it's been a small community that got about 90% of its tax base from the big plant in the neighborhood. And of course that causes chaos. That caused chaos for the Zion community back in the late 1990s. They lost 55% of their tax base overnight, and they still haven't recovered. There are still economic effects in that community from that inability to provide support in advance. So our position, and we've used the Exelon bailout debates as a way to interject this into the discussion in Illinois, our position is before a reactor closes, they must enter into a contract with the local community. This must be mandated from the state government that you will provide a just transitions plan. Details are negotiable, and that's, we really got to sit down and think about some of those. But the idea is you create a pool of money that is escrowed and is not available until the reactor closes. When it closes, when the license is terminated, the money is available partly to protect the tax base that's going to get whacked, because it will, and partly to be used for economic redevelopment, to bring in new jobs, new industries, worker retraining. And it's got to be a partnership between the community and the utility. Now, I know those of you are saying, well, where's the leverage, right? Because I'm sure you've had a lot of fun dealing with these guys here at VY. We've had the same situation. We deal with Exelon. I mean, they're the big boys right now. But we use the bailout as kind of a leverage piece. We say, we were suggesting to our colleagues and friends and our legislators, you don't even sit at the table with these guys to talk about bailout until they have a just transitions in place. So this is where we start getting political. And just transitions is a political piece. So that's the first big hunk, and we can go into some details later, and I invite you to take some of our papers on this. These will be too small to read, so I'll just yak. Go ahead. Yeah, just transitions. So here's what we do. The second one is a concept that I mentioned earlier. It's called Make Whole, and it's again for the orphaned waste communities. These are the ones who became suddenly de facto high-level radioactive waste dumps because we don't have the magic hole in the ground. We're arguing, and many mayors are starting to argue, that they should be compensated for the economic damage having a high-level waste dump in their front yard does to the community. I mean, let's face it, not even Donald Trump would build a hotel next to the waste dump at Zion, as dim as he is. There's a reason for this. So, all right, I got you. But you get the idea. They're an anchor on the community, and it really has serious, serious problems. So it turns out that we, meaning the folks in Illinois, I've been working with the mayor of Zion on this for the last 2 years now, we have gotten the senator from Illinois, Sammy Duckworth, and the representative, Brad Schneider, to introduce federal legislation, S 1903, calling for a make-whole mechanism to be put in place for these orphaned communities. So part of it is a mixture of incentives and tax breaks, but then there's a $94 million pot of gold that's available to those communities over a 7-year period. We know it doesn't have a snowball's chance in this Congress, but you got to get it out there now so that when the responsible people ever do come back to Washington, we can say, this makes sense, let's talk about this. So we have to develop the vocabulary, we have to own the dialogue, we have to own the propositions and the plans so that they can say, oh, they don't know, they don't have a plan. Oh, sure, we've got a plan. Since 2002 here in Connecticut, we had Haas. Now we have this. And it also turns out that Representative Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii has recently introduced a bill for just transitions for fossil fuel communities. And we have approached her office to see if she would be willing to include nuclear communities in that. So it's in the works, but we have to do the homework back here, whip up the support with your local delegation, our local delegation, to become co-sponsors to these bills and push them. And again, they're back at the table there. We've covered workforce training. You can move on. And here's a few other things that we're missing that we think need to be tweaked somehow. Congress needs to deal with the fact, or somebody, perhaps at the state level, needs to deal with the fact that none of these decommissionings are very transparent. I gave you the financial ones earlier. There, you know, there's questions about how money is being used like crazy at Zion, but without adequate documentation, no audits, how can we prove it? So we believe that the state legislatures are the location to begin working on this leverage piece of requiring truly independent, community-based oversight groups. They should be affiliated with a state agency of some kind so that you preserve the ability to FOIA information. If it's totally independent, you lose that capability. So we have to work to make the process more open, more visible. And I already talked about make whole, so move on here. So, what do we do with high-level rad waste? Well, as we've said before, we're all in favor of hardened on-site storage, no CIS, no yucca, and a truly scientific-based examination of where do we go from here. Next. You all have seen this one before, I'm sure. Here's a schematic of HOS, hardened on-site storage. We do not have this anywhere in the United States at this point. The industry box, NRC box, we have to force the issue. And we're working on some ways of making the issue, let's say, hard to say no to. And it has to do with the upgrades in weaponry that's available on the black market. And it also has to do with the fact that very soon, British Airways and other European air firms want to come to the United States using the largest commercial nuclear airliner, the Airbus A380, which has not been factored into any NRC calculations on dry casks. So we may be able to revisit this and leverage hardened on-site storage in a way that we never were before. This is the bad news legislation, HR 3053. Anyone hear about this one, the Shimkus bill? Okay, a few of you have, and again, we have materials at the back. This was introduced by one of our Illinois Congress people, John Shimkus, who thinks that Yucca Mountain is just a sweetheart place to put high-level radioactive waste. So we are pointing out to the people the many flaws of the past of Yucca. Chlorine 36, Secretary of the Air Force. Another one of my favorites is that before she became the NRC chair, Allison McFarland, a trained geologist, gave a presentation in Illinois about Yucca Mountain, where she announced to the audience that from a geological standpoint, Yucca Mountain fails 2 of the 4 international standards for the safe disposal of high-level radioactive waste. So again, it's not the no-nukes kooks saying Yucca won't work. It's a trained geologist who used to head up the NRC. So these are points you can utilize in opposing Yucca Mountain. 3053 also wants the centralized interim storage facilities in New Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. We're opposing that for the transportation reasons primarily, because we think that's a leveraging point. And there are other horror stories in the bill, but unfortunately it's moving on a fast track, and there's a real good chance that it may come up in the next week or 2. So we have materials at the back, okay? We ask you to take them. It summarizes the problems with 3053. We ask you to contact your delegation, have them say no. It's counterintuitive. I know folks want to get the high-level rad waste out of your communities as soon as possible. My colleague and friend, Mayor Al Hill of Zion, wants the same thing. But he has the smarts enough to know that even the Blue Ribbon Commission, under its best operating circumstances, is not going to get that waste out for 8 to 10 years. In the meantime, as a mayor, he has a responsibility to his community to fight for the safest storage possible, which we know is hardened on-site storage. So that's the approach that we are using on that with HR 3053. The good news legislation, I wasn't able to get it up in time for my slideshow. As I mentioned, S 1903, which is the make whole legislation in the Senate, and Tulsi Gabbard's Just Transitions legislation, HR 3671. Moving on. So, you know, I've used this slide many, many times. When you ask people these very broad, you know, nebulous kind of questions of, wouldn't you like safe nuclear power? You're going to get 80% of, you know, American population agreeing to that. But then it's a good idea to listen to another expert who we started out the slideshow with, saying that sometimes, you know, theory and practice don't match up. So I'm going to stop there, see if there are any questions. We can talk later. Please help yourself to the literature. Don't you feel better now? Did I do better than Arnie and Ray? Thank you very much.
question?
Over here.
What's the difference in cost between our regular dry cask versus hardened?
Historically, I've heard it doubles it. Okay, now, but let's put that doubling.
$1 million a cask to 2 or something like that?
Pardon me?
From $1 million per cask to 2 million?
Yeah, and it's not even per cask, it's doing per cask, meaning the cask itself may not double in price because it's the same cask. When you start burning things, separating them out in broader pieces of real estate, it's going to cost more. The other thing we want, though, is active monitoring. I mean, the current proposed monitoring system that the NRC has is a joke. Walk through once a week and do a visual inspection. Oh yeah, I mean, that makes no sense at all. So those are the kind of costs that we think need to be factored in. The way we put it, though, at Zion is, okay, so we double the cost of hardened on-site storage from, what is it, 63 million to 126 million. And they don't want to do it. So what that says to us, and we say back, is, so now we know the value of Lake Michigan is less than $123 million, right? Because if something goes wrong, that's the drinking water supply for 16 million people that goes down the toilet. So we try and put it in a context which makes a little bit more sense and people understand.
That kind of gets to my question. You say if something goes wrong, there goes the drinking water for 16 million people. I mean, what is the failure pathway that lets that happen? And then what are the efforts that somebody would try to take to stop it? I mean, what is the failure mode and how does it?
All right, well, in the case of Zion, and this is something we should be aware of too. What we've observed over the last 7 years is every decommissioning thing we've looked at has some unique thing that doesn't match anywhere else. So I'll tell you what Zion is, and maybe you can extrapolate it to BY here, but in the case of Zion, we have 63 dry casks on a pad that's roughly 200 by 250 feet. That cask pad, we've calculated, because they won't give us the numbers, is about 300 yards, maybe 250 yards to Lake Michigan, okay? Which doesn't sound like anything special until you factor in the fact that every outgoing flight out of O'Hare Field, the world's second busiest airport, that goes to Europe or the East Coast, every day flies over Zion. So, it's a crapshoot. And then if you layer onto that the Airbus A380, which hasn't been calculated in terms of its risk, if they're, we're not talking even terrorists per se. We're talking about unfortunate accidents with aircraft. Zion is 7 minutes away from O'Hare Field in normal flight operating time. So I'm laying out a scenario, and it's not the only scenario. There are other scenarios in terms of lake effect snows, in terms of, just earlier this year, 2 guys were arrested outside of a state park, which is adjacent to the Zion site, with jihadist signs, and they were members of ISIS and proclaiming that, they're here. It's a 5-minute walk from the entrance of that park to the dry cask pad. All I'm saying is it's a crazy world right now, and it's a crapshoot. So do you want to pay the insurance policy or not? Well, I don't know, but when you mess with the Great Lakes, folks like us get a little testy. So those are just a couple of the possibilities. The first time I encountered dry casks was in the 1980s in Michigan. Mary Sinclair, some of you may know this name, she's unfortunately deceased, was opposing the construction of dry casks in Michigan. And if you've ever been to Chicago, I don't know if you have or not, we're on the west side of Lake Michigan. You got to go under Lake Michigan and then up into what's called the snow belt in Indiana, which Chris Williams can tell you about. And then you proceed into Michigan, which also has a snow belt all the way up to Lansing. The day the NRC held the hearing about the safety of dry casks, I had to drive through one of those snow belt blizzards. And all I could think of as I'm driving through is, I wonder who's out on the pad now shoveling snow. Because if those vents get blocked and nobody's out there, those casks are going to overheat. And it'll mess up the cladding on the fuel, and you'll have a pile of radioactive rubble in no time. Lots of things can go wrong. So, our position is using hard on-site storage, you at least reduce the amount of potential damage that could occur. When you have things bunched together, well, let's put it to you this way. The unfortunate event that took place in Las Vegas not too long ago was largely catastrophic because there were a lot of people bunched together. In a parallel way, dry casks are the same thing. If something goes wrong with one or two, it affects the ability to retain control and security and safety of all the other 61. So these are concepts which we don't think have been adequately addressed. Does that answer your question?
Well, not really. I mean, you say the plane hits the cast and the cast
Oh,
will
no.
go down and then you'll have chlorine going into the lake. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm trying to
Okay.
sort of put the pathway.
Yeah, so you would have 300,000 liters of aviation fuel, you would have a fire, first of all. If any of the other vents get blocked, from the other dry casks, which was kind of likely if you're bringing down a, 500-ton aircraft, fully loaded, fully fueled, whatever, you knock over some of the casks, that's a possibility. So you have vents closed, you have casks falling over, some may be breached because every engine on this airplane has the mass of an F-4 Phantom jet fighter. Okay, and if you're going at 300-400 miles an hour or more, because it's presumably be a downward trajectory, you're going to cause some damage to
You're
many
envisioning
of the
like a
casks.
gigantic dirty bomb.
Exactly.
Not necessarily that we're having
Right.
a fuel pool fire or something.
No, there is no more fuel pool. So
Or
this is a
vengeful
gigantic,
fire.
good analogy, a dirty bomb for sure. And then whatever the local operating conditions are happening, rain, snow, sun, wind, it all factors in, but it usually goes one place, water rolls downhill. And the only thing downhill from the Zion site is Lake Michigan. So I won't say it would happen immediately. I won't say how much it would happen. I'm just saying, has anyone really
Well, what I guess they would do
calculated
is simply raise the limits on what you can be exposed to. Right? Just everything's fine, we're just raising the limits.
Well, there you go, folks. We have a solution. Is that a question or a?
That's a question.
Oh.
What is Alice McFarland doing? Is Alice, have you ever spoken to Alice McFarland? Is she speaking out on this issue at all?
Not currently. She's back in academia, and that's all I know. She's still a geologist, though. I mean, she didn't renounce her profession, so I don't really know more about her.
What was her name again, please?
Allison McFarland. She was the NRC chair a few years back, for a few years, about 2.5 years. We call her the Den Mother. Right?
Yeah, that's a hard and on-site story. Just like as a practical matter, I'm curious as to why you don't include in your discussion Fort Calhoun, Humboldt Bay, the Ukrainian storage, which, they're all using the Holtec 100U cask, specifically designed to be put at mostly below grade. Yeah.
Good point. And all I can say is time and ignorance primarily. Yeah, I again try to chunk it down either to locality, but these are again perfect examples. Some of you may or may not recall a few years back when there was a huge flood on the Missouri River, and the plant that was in Nebraska became surrounded with water. We renamed it Port Calhoun at that point because the only way you could get to it was by boat and helicopter. The plant was totally surrounded. But if you look at those aerial photographs from the flood at Port Calhoun, there is one section of the plant site which, whoever you were, Mr. Engineer, thank you, was elevated, and it was the dry cask pad. It was sufficiently elevated enough so even the flood, as bad as it was on the Missouri River, was only lapping at the edge of the dry cask there.
They deliberately sculpted that, built that up.
Yes. So I think, and that's a good example of, prescient engineering preventing a potential calamity.
People here should know that NEC spent a lot of time and energy trying to convince our Public Utilities Commission that a underground storage or the underground storage cask combined with built-up berm was the way to go, and we got no traction here. Yeah.
Well, we're hoping, I'll harp on the political once again because that's a point I left out earlier. One of the things I've been doing the last couple of years is recognizing that the mayor of Zion is critically important. So we've had a lot of conversations, and after all of these conversations, I think he's getting religion. He understands that he's stuck with the waste, so he's in favor of hard and on-site storage now, that's the first thing. But we both recognize that nobody's gonna listen to us, you know. 60 years of no nukes kooks have been ignored, you know, forever. But somebody might listen to the mayors. So he and I have been talking about how do we organize mayors of reactor communities. And so we're starting to do outreach in Illinois and elsewhere, especially amongst the orphan community folks, to get together in the same room and just hammer out what are the significant problems and issues that government needs to address. So they're doing it there. Some of you, I mentioned this earlier, Manna Joe Green in New York has been convening calls, and Mayor Hill and I have been a part of that. We are talking about getting a bunch of folks together to go to the National Conference of Mayors in January in Washington, D.C., and try and get a resolution, or at least a panel, on their national platform. Start talking about reactor closure issues now. And if they don't do it, we've got some plan Bs in mind as well. So we're gonna show up regardless. But it's the idea of, we're gonna try and galvanize the mayors in their own self-interest to get just transitions, to protect them so they're not screwed when the plants close, get the make whole, and protect the communities with hard and on-site storage. So that's where we think the rubber's really gonna hit the road, and we'll kind of move this along a little farther, with the mayor's help. And we invite you to be a part of it. Okay.
So, in terms of the national sort of effort to combat the swift move towards centralized interim storage, which our federal delegation supports, by the way, as enlightened as they tend to be here in Vermont, they do support CIS right now. How, you know, besides like the mayors, are there any other, I mean, it's really not that many communities nationally, so it's difficult to rally.
Well, if you count the ones that are operating, you still have about 60 or 70 mayors to play with. And maybe even some previous mayors too. They might want to weigh in on this to tell some of their stories. But we're just thinking, again, the powers that be need to hear from a new audience that at least they have some respect for and maybe have more accountability to than us. You know, some of those mayors sit on the state party committees, you know, or they sit on other local boards and whatever that are important to the Democrats, the Republicans, to the Libertarians, or whoever. And that's where we want these, we're planting the vocabulary, the message, and the reasons. And we know it's not going to be an overnight thing. It's going to take years, but got to start somewhere.
And David, if I could just make a point, I believe, not to let up the pressure, but the logistical, it's a logistical nightmare, this CIS, the whole idea. I mean, they don't have a train car that can handle these. I mean, there's so much that has to be done, not to mention, as people become more aware of it, the communities, the cities that are going to be on these paths. You know, that's not going to happen soon. And in the meantime, renewables are you know, taking off. The whole idea of nuclear power is going to lose favor. As far as the interim storage, that too, I think as these efforts start to take hold.
And I guess another way, you know, I looked at the map too, and you're actually in pretty good geography here because it's pretty much all going out.
Yeah.
You know? Mayor Hill would have a slightly different take on it because it's all coming through his backyard. You know, so it's Mayor Hill who needs to talk to your delegation and say, hey, what gives you the right to ride through my community with these, you know, dirty bombs, if you will, and then pollute another community in Texas and New Mexico, which are already economically, you know, beat up and depressed and environmental justice victims. We have to, you know, this is something our movement has neglected for far too long. We get hung up on the geekdom stuff, all the RADs, REMs, becquerels, all the technical jargon and the laws and whatever. Where the hell's the justice? This is our strong point. You know, this is just ethically wrong. And who are you to say that your kids are worth more than the kids in West Texas? That's how I would put it to him. Show me the calculus. Which university studies that?
Trump University.
Is anybody doing hard and
Okay.
on-site storage? I mean, where are
Yes.
they doing it?
Yes. being done in Europe.
Yeah, in Europe, Fukushima.
And in Europe.
No, but now if you have hardened on-site storage, is there a reason why they don't want to do that in terms of their ability to get at that fuel at a later date if they want it for something else?
No, it's a cost factor totally. In fact, as you heard, there are lots of ways you can engineer a hardened on-site storage site facility. But you can get to the fuel. That's the important thing, if needed. The other thing, though, is if there's a problem with the fuel, it's localized to that one area, and it doesn't prevent other people from coming in to do the fixing, where you don't have that with the bowling in the bowling alley technique. Yeah. Anyone else? Oh, in the back.
Yeah, I was wondering whether you had ever come across the use of constant water spray during when they take down the concrete buildings to eliminate the dust going around, because here Vermont Yankee is just across the road from a public school.
Yeah, and this is another interesting compare and contrast situation. The vendor in Illinois was a company called Zion Solutions LLC, which is a subsidiary of Energy Solutions, which is based in Utah. And they cut a sweetheart deal with Exelon Corporation in the early 2000s, there, 2008, 9, 10. They tell us that their proprietary techniques utilized something along the lines of what you said. They did a lot of that internal rubbleization with the reactor buildings closed primarily, and they tell us it was largely done robotically. Eventually you got to get the stuff out of there, that's for sure. How they did that, that's part of the problem because of the transparency issue. We didn't get a lot of good material back from these guys. That's actually a point I neglected in the slideshow because I was in a hurry, but we think that local community oversight groups need to have the ability to have that level of detail, to be able to get into a site, to have reports, have them in a timely way, have them reported to the state legislature, to answer the kinds of questions that you just brought up. So in our case, yeah, we were told there was that spray and this proprietary technique, and they did the internal gouging, and then the rest is allegedly just concrete rubble, which they're shipping out to Utah. Now, if it's just concrete rubble, I don't know why it's going to Utah, because that's a radioactive waste dump, but that's another discussion. I'm sorry I couldn't answer your question any more fully than that.
Where do you fall out on the controversy surrounding the use of these whole tech casts versus the 9-inch thick cast or casts that Donna Gilmore referred to?
Yeah, I've heard arguments both ways on this, and I'm sure all of you have too, which cask is better. Dave Lockbaum made a fairly interesting critique of the 9-inch casks as well, in terms of thermal conductivity and things like that. So it has its deficits as well. I take a step back, first of all, acknowledging that all we're left with is the cream of the crop. That would be our choice, whatever it is. And I hearken back to a late whistleblower that we knew in Illinois, whose name is Oscar Sharani. He was a rising star in the ComEd Exelon company for many years. He was an engineer. He was a quality assurance expert. He was in international demand at conferences. And lo and behold, when Oliver Kingsley came on board at Exelon Corporation as their chief nuclear person, there was a big push to get dry casks built, put up at Dresden, and I believe Quad Cities. Those are the two oldest reactors we have in Illinois. And Oscar's team evaluated the process and said, whoa, I can't sign off on this. There's no quality assurance. He went through the documentation, so there's no way we could verify that those casks will perform the way you say they're going to do it. And he got blackballed. He got laterally arabesqued. He eventually was forced into leaving the company. So suddenly, the star of the show is a pariah. This is what sticks with me, is whatever design gets picked, can we go back to the quality control trail, paper trail, and verify it? So again, knowing that all engineering somewhere along the line is going to have a glitch, I guess maybe some of the casks are better than others. I would say Kevin Camps would be the person to bring in here to talk about that, not me. In terms of the thick wall versus thin wall, let's at least examine the fact that the thin walls are probably pretty crappy, you know?
Yeah.
So let's start with that and address that point.
They can't be repaired.
Yeah, or inspected.
Great.
And that's part of the thing we were insisting on with Haas, is the casks need to be remotely monitored in real time. So,
But Dr. Singh says they're safe.
there you go. Well, you know,
David,
sing.
thank you. We should-
For what?
kind of-
Oh, you guys want to stay anymore? So don't you feel better now?
Oh, yeah, yes.
Thank you very much.
Quickly here, thanks so much for coming tonight. A heads up to for our sponsors, Grafton Village Handmade Cheese, Mocha Joe's Roasting Company, and Dutton's Farm Stand. They generously gave to this event. I have just a couple of closing thoughts. 2,000 years ago, Rabbi Tarfon said, "Don't be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Live justly, love mercy, and walk humbly. You are not expected to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it." And Clarissa Pinkola Estes continues, "Ours is not the task of fixing the entire world all at once, but of stretching to mend the part that is within our reach." That's why we're here today. Thank you.
Thank you.